Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Fred Murphy with the Marxist Education Project. I'm very happy to welcome you here for a talk on capitalism and the politics of nature, based on a new book by Alyssa Battistoni. Alyssa is here to talk about her book for about 40 minutes, and following that, we'll open it up for questions and comments. Alyssa is an assistant professor of political science at Barnard College. She's the co-author of A Planet to Win, Why We Need a Green New Deal, and her writing has appeared in many left publications, including The Nation, The Guardian, Boston Review, N+1, Dissent, The New Statesman, Jacobin, and New Left Review. And she is the author of Free Gifts, Capitalism and the Politics of Nature, which I have been reading for the last week. I'm still not done with it, but it's a very rich book. I think it's a major contribution to all conversations about environmentalism, Marxism, and it's just it has a diverse set of topics: the nature of freedom and domination under capitalism, bringing existentialism and the work of Sartre back into Marxist conversations, the theoretical status of the notion of the free gifts of nature that appears in the early political economists and taken up later by Marx, the theory of externalities that figures prominently in today's ecological economics, social reproduction theory, and a number of other critical topics. So with that, I'll just turn it over to Alyssa, and we will rejoin you for Q&A once Alyssa has made her presentation. Thanks very much.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks so much, Fred, for inviting me and for the intro. And thanks, everyone, for joining on a Sunday afternoon. And apologies to anyone who showed up last time, only for me not to show up. And I'm sorry for my time zone mix-up. I was really embarrassed about that, but I appreciate everyone coming back out. So as Fred said, I'm just going to talk for about 40 minutes about kind of the overall kind of what the book is doing and some big picture ideas. And then I'm happy to sort of answer questions about some of the stuff I didn't get to. Like Fred said, there's a lot of different things going on in it. Just have any conversation that people want to have. So I'm going to just share my screen. So let me know if this is working. Can everyone see that? Yeah. Okay.
Yes.
Great. So I'll just get started. Okay, so in the endless expanse of the universe, every living thing we know of exists within a vertical band spanning a few meters of a single planet, Earth. And the space of life, sometimes termed the critical zone, is about as large relative to the Earth as an apple's skin to its flesh. As small as it is, it nevertheless supports an astonishing array of life, from sea stars at the sunless bottom of the ocean to vicuñas in the altiplano of the Andes, over 1,000 species of ant in the Amazon rainforest alone. Or at least it has. Today, many of the Earth's beings are in trouble. Catastrophic climate change is the most pressing ecological challenge we now face, but far from the only one. So we've seen vast forests felled for timber, marshlands converted to plantations, 1 million species presently at the risk of extinction. And this is a crisis for not just for environmentalists or nature lovers or non-human animals or beings, but for everyone living on Earth. So millions of people around the world, including most indigenous peoples, rely directly on wild plants and animals for sustenance. Billions more rely indirectly on other species, from wild insects that pollinate crops to marshes that filter water. And every single one of us relies on other beings to keep the planet habitable, from microbes in the soil to plankton in the oceans. So this realization has prompted a reckoning in many quarters. In political discourse, it's become routine in recent years, to the point of cliche, to describe climate change as an existential threat. Scientists have proposed naming a new geological era, the Anthropocene, marked by the entrance of human activity into the fossil record. In economics, however, the astonishing transformations of our planet are typically attributed to a surprisingly narrow cause: the absence of price. As the economist Nicholas Stern famously observed in his landmark report on the economics of climate change, greenhouse gas emissions are externalities and represent the biggest market failure the world has seen. In other words, the effects of accumulating greenhouse gases are not factored into the prices of market goods and as a result aren't taken into account in economic decisions. And this problem is probably most glaring with respect to carbon, but it's also much broader. So the economist Pavan Sukhdev argues that what he calls the economic invisibility of nature has serious consequences since nobody pays for instance, the Amazon's rain factory. Although it's the likes of peat bogs and bees that keep life possible and bearable, the economic journalist Jonathan Guthrie notes in the Financial Times, we've typically not attributed any value to them, and this, he adds, seems like a mistake. So the gap between these discourses, the language of existential threat and economic error, is pretty vertiginous. Is it really possible that this mistake could bring an end to life on Earth as we know it? Oh, I'm missing a slide there somewhere. And if so, why hasn't it been corrected? For if this is a mistake or a failure, it's one that's proven enduringly difficult to rectify. The paradox of nature's non-value is persistent in political economic thought. Similar observations have been made for decades, even centuries. At the same time, it's perplexing to encounter claims that nature is endangered because it doesn't appear in the market. After all, capitalism is supposedly said to famously put a price on everything. It's notoriously merciless in its disregard for moral value, religious belief, and sentimental attachment. The realm of the market perpetually expands, stripping ever wider swaths of the world for parts. Markets regularly destroy things that are bought and sold, such that everything precious must be protected from them, or at least so generations of critics have claimed. So if capitalism is characterized by relentless commodification, then its continual failure to value many kinds of nature is puzzling. And this problem is, I think, more profound than has typically been acknowledged and deserves more careful critical attention than it's received. And this is what the book is about, the problem of the free gift of nature, more specifically about capitalism's persistent failure to value non-human nature and what that means for the politics of both nature and capitalism. So there's, we might ask why look at capitalism to understand the politics of nature. I suspect that this crowd doesn't need much convincing of that. But one of the things that I argue is really that fundamentally that, we've seen these sort of arguments around whether capital or climate change marks the end of nature or the return of nature. But in any case, one of the things I'm trying to do in the book is show that nature is present in all of our politics and all of our political thought. And that we can sort of, if we look at, read political theory sort of aslant, we can find nature in all kinds of political theory, not just sort of that around environmental issues. But that one of the densest sort of sites of interaction between nature and politics is in, what we call the economy. In particular, the economy is structured by a particular form of social organization, that is capitalism, which is now, of course, the political economic system upon which now nearly all human beings rely for our livelihoods, attend to our wants and needs, and so on. Capitalism, I argue, is really the dominant force remaking nature today. It's sort of what I describe in the book as a planet-making force. So if we're going to understand the politics of nature, we just have to understand how capitalism treats it, both how it represents nature socially and makes use of it materially. And so this is sort of the claim of the book, that capitalism systematically treats nature as a free gift, something that can be taken without payment or replenishing, something that's materially useful but tends not to appear in exchange, and that this isn't an accident or an oversight, rather it's foundational to how capitalism works, to sort of internal social relations. So I'll say in the rest of the talk a bit more about the interventions and the idea of the free gift in particular. So there's sort of three main things the book is doing. One is to offer a theory of the free gift of nature as what I could describe as a capitalist social form, akin to the commodity, characterized by usefulness lacking exchange value. The second is to sort of, see what happens to move beyond this kind of conceptual argument about the free gift and look at it as a concrete phenomenon, look at what happens when the sort of social relation of the free gift sort of materializes in the world, tracking these concrete phenomena that result, the kinds of conceptual apparatuses developed to make sense of them, including things like the externality, as Fred mentioned, and some of the political struggles that erupt around them. And then the third is to offer a new critique of capitalism's treatment of nature that's rooted less in environmental consequences than what those consequences indicate about sort of human freedom and human social relations to one another. So I'm going to mostly focus on the first here, but I'm happy to talk about the other two in discussion and Q&A. So I take the description of nature as a gift of production. The idea of the free gift isn't mine. I take it from both the classical political economists who write in the 18th and 19th centuries, sort of describing the rise of capitalism, trying to make sense of capitalism as they see it emerging. And to these thinkers, the role of non-human elements in production is something they comment on frequently. So you see people like the physiocrat Turgot arguing that nature makes a pure gift to production. David Ricardo describes the abundance of natural agents that perform their work gratuitously. The French economist Jean-Baptiste Say provides some of the most extensive descriptions of what he describes as natural agents. So he talks about these as being really ubiquitous in production, everything from the action of the organs and viscera that help produce wool in a flock of sheep, to the vegetative power of the soil that generates crops, and the geophysical properties of the world, like the wind that drives mills and sails. So it seems to say, obvious that nature plays this kind of a central role in economic production. And this is what I think makes him quite striking to read today, because it's clearly true that human beings don't generate wealth alone. That there are many other, sort of kinds of, non-human beings that are also essential to these processes of production of, goods and wealth. But I think that this is almost too obvious, because both classical political economists and then a number of contemporary, environmental and ecological economists and thinkers who have tried to sort of restore the sense of the natural elements that are at work in our economies have often tended to take the contributions of nature to production too much at face value. Because it's true, of course, that much of what we think of as wealth is produced by beings other than ourselves, but what we think of as wealth isn't necessarily what capitalism designates as value. And so we need Marx's critique of political economy to help locate the free gift of nature more firmly within capitalism in particular. So before I say a bit more about Marx's critique, I just want to say a word about how I use Marx, because his ecological legacy is complicated, as people are probably aware. So, on the one hand, he's often been criticized by ecological thinkers as a sort of Promethean modernist who's committed to the domination of nature. And then more recently, of course, he's been recovered by thinkers like John Bellamy Foster and Kohei Saito as a sort of proto-ecological thinker who's concerned with problems like soil fertility and the metabolic rift. And I'm not really sort of doing either of these. I'm not that interested, honestly, in whether Marx was really an ecological thinker or not. I'm not trying to read him substantively to sort of find places where he talks about particular environmental issues, or reading him exegetically to show that he really sort of had this ecological consciousness. I'm instead trying to draw on him methodologically, and to sort of look at how he confronts one of the core questions of ecological thought, which is sort of this relationship between nature and society, the natural and social orders, and how he situates that within a particular capitalism as a particular form of social organization. And, as I argue, and I'll say a bit more about this relationship between the natural and the social, is really central to his overall analysis of capitalism, often discussed in terms of things like content and form, and I'll come back to that. But this is also really crucial to his sort of critique of the classical political economists. He says that they've essentially adopted a naive view of the material world, that they've considered the material forms of existence apart from the social conditions in which they appear in capitalist production. So they've understood that value to consist in sort of sheer material things and land, nature, and various modifications, as if wealth sort of just grows out of the soil, is sort of generated by nature itself in some way. And he's quite critical of this. He says, again, we need to understand this as how these forms of material wealth appear in capitalism. And nature, he argues briefly in volume 3 in Capital, is a free gift to capital alone, that capitalists alone effectively have benefited from the productivity gains enabled by the deployment of natural agents. They alone have claim to the resulting wealth, so they have really been the sort of beneficiaries. But Marx doesn't say that much more about the free gift. It's a term that's often referenced in sort of eco-socialist, eco-Marxist literature. You may have come across it in other work to describe, this basic relationship that capitalism has to nature, how capitalism treats nature. But it's pretty, under theorized, I think, and yet it's a pretty peculiar phrase when we think about it. Because, on the one hand, it seems redundant. It is one of the defining features of gifts that they aren't bought and sold. They are something that you acquire through some other means. And this is often understood in a couple of different ways. On the one hand, in a lot of Western philosophy, the gift is understood as a sort of unidirectional expression of generosity, sort of pure altruism in a sense, something that you can't or aren't supposed to return. And then on the other hand, of course, as a way of thinking of the gift and gift societies and gifts economies as fundamentally reciprocal. So gifts, they incur obligations. They have to be returned. They create these lasting social relationships. So as Robin Wall Kimmerer says, true gifts are not free. So it's either sort of redundant or oxymoronic, it would seem. And although these point in different directions, they both, in both understandings, gifts tend to be treated as outside the logic of commodity exchange altogether. Sometimes they're seen as offering an alternative to capitalism per se. And this, I think neither of these kinds of gifts is what the free gift is. The free gift of nature is neither of these, and it's not an alternative to capitalism at all. So I think we have to look at the sort of modifier free as a clue that the free gift is a category defined in relation to the market. The free gift of nature is free in the sense of costless or gratuitous. It denotes that something is priced at zero. And really natural agents, I argue, become free gifts only in capitalist social relations, in a situation of generalized commodity exchange and market dependence, in which most human labor is sold for a wage and production is oriented not towards use values, but the accumulation of abstract value. Because only, where most things have a price, does it even make sense to describe nature's gifts as free. So the free gift, I argue, is a capitalist social form, no less central to capitalism than more familiar concepts like the commodity. It's how nature appears in capitalist societies. So to understand the free gift a little bit more, I think we have to bring the question that we often pose in environmental thought, sort of what is nature, what's this relationship to society, together with one posed by Marx, which is what is value under capitalism. And Marx writes in Capital, sort of the challenge or question he poses to classical political economy is precisely on these terms. Political economy has indeed analyzed value, he says, but it's never asked the question why this content has assumed this particular form. So political economists have said, purported to study the meaning and source of economic value, but haven't really asked what value is or what's distinctive about how capitalism defines it. And, for Marx, capitalism is really the system of sort of duality and appearances and sort of what lies beneath. And, capital begins with an analysis, of course, of the commodity as what Marx describes as capitalism's elementary social form. And the commodity, he famously says, is defined by its dual character. It has both a material content and social form. Sometimes describes this as both natural form and value form. And that is, correlated with both use and exchange value, sort of assessed in concrete and abstract terms. So, this is, I'm sure, familiar to people here, but just in brief, we tend to see things, in sort of the material world in their natural form. It's, it's the natural form or material content is characterized by these sort of qualitative and material elements that make things, characterized by their use value and the things that literally make things useful or not. So we might think about, the wooden table as what Marx describes as an ordinary sensuous thing. We might think about the type of wood or its usefulness for a dinner party or its sturdiness or something like that. And in this form, Marx says there's nothing mysterious about it in the kind of, form of natural form use value. It's sort of straightforwardly what it is. It's only when it appears in the social form of the commodity, when its value is expressed in this abstract quantitative form of exchange value, that it becomes peculiar, it requires investigation, and we can't sort of correlate, that usefulness directly to its value. So, for Marx, all capitalist social forms have this dual character. They exist sort of in this, real world, and then in the sort of capitalism's particular social reality and its form of appearances. And Marx tends to understand nature as sort of like mere use value, and suggests that it's therefore irrelevant to the critique of political economy. But what I want to say is that I think the persistence of these things that have use value that sort of repeatedly fails to appear in the form of exchange value, should push us to ask more about how, in constituting some things as having value, capitalism constitutes other as lacking it. And Marx is, of course, particularly interested in the status of human labor under capitalism. And he asks why so many different human activities are characterized or classified under the simple category labor, and recognized in accordance with their ability to generate value. Why is labor organized as it is, and how might it be organized differently? But I think in posing this question about why human labor is expressed in terms of value, Marx implicitly poses another, why non-human nature is not. So the book tries to apply Marx's question to nature and to ask, why does such an enormously wide range of content, these material capacities ranging from soil fertility to animal digestion, tend to take the same form, the free gift of nature? And sort of following from that, why does capitalism draw such a stark distinction between human labor and other elements of production? And this is, a complicated argument, but I'll just say very briefly that my argument, I argue that capitalism is a humanism. Marx is often criticized for being anthropocentric, but sort of focusing on the human labor. But I argue this is sort of a reflection of, comes from the critique of capitalism, critique of political economy. It's a reflection of the categories that capitalism, I think, entrenches, and then he's trying to diagnose. So I basically argue, sort of make these two arguments about the two capacities rooted in distinctively human forms of consciousness. So both the indeterminacy of human labor and the ability to exchange time for a wage become inordinately important within capitalist societies, and that nature's lack of value is sort of downstream from capitalism's transformation of social relations among humans. I won't go into a lot of detail here. I can say more about it if people are curious about these arguments. But what I do want to emphasize is that this, what I'm trying to do here is offer a fairly minimal account of human capacities that I think do become particularly significant in capitalism, but that isn't sort of making an argument about the exceptional or superior qualities of human beings per se. So an argument for like distinction without hierarchy, and to recognize the ways that these particular forms of human consciousness are central to and necessary for capitalism. So I will want to move on to the other couple of things that the book is doing, and not spend too much time on this. So again, there's a lot going on here, so I'm happy to answer questions if people have them, but I want to say a bit more about some of the other things that I'm doing in the book. I start off with this kind of more theoretical account of the free gift, and that is at a fairly high level of abstraction. It's engaging a lot with Marx's analysis of the commodity, again at that higher level of abstraction, and trying to sort of think through this sort of category on a conceptual level. But the book also really tries to consider the kinds of concrete phenomena and problems that have arisen from this basic paradox of usefulness without value, and to also understand how that paradox has been conceived in other social and political thought. So there are 4 chapters that look at what I think of as sort of different iterations of the free gift. And so those look at both different iterations of it and different sorts of sites where that problem appears, and the kinds of subjects and politics and so on that spring up around them. So I first sort of go into the hidden abode of production, and consider both the sort of the ways that the gifts of nature are channeled in production in the form not only of sort of the gifts described before, but things like machinery, the ways that they're remade and reorganized and restructured through these non-human elements of production. But also look at what Marx describes as the free gift of human cooperation, of human cooperative labor, and the sort of the kinds of the ways that human beings working together, sort of more than the sum of their parts, and can kind of do these things that they can't do alone. And I look at really how, especially that both non-human nature and human labor are organized by capital in order to unleash both of these free gifts to the maximum extent, and sort of what happens there. I look at what emanates from these sites of production, the kind of byproducts of commodity production that we often describe in terms of pollution or these sorts of material outputs that are described often in economics in terms of externalities or social cost in the realm of what we tend to call something like the environment. I look at so-called reproductive labor in the household, the kinds of human labor that tend not to be waged, that tend to take the form of the free gift or appear as a free gift of nature, and engage there, of course, with Marxist feminists and socialist feminist thought on the status of unwaged, domestic, reproductive, household work. And then I look at sort of the set of ecological activities that are, necessary for regenerating human and non-human life, that are also, sort of regenerating the conditions of production, but also the conditions for life more generally, and that are often described in economics in terms of ecosystem services or natural capital in sort of the biosphere. And these chapters are a bit more historical. They're trying to look at the period that we now understand as the Great Acceleration. So this is the period since roughly 1950, which has seen the rapid increase of human activity, or it's usually described as sort of human activity in general of various kinds, paired with indicators of biospheric decline. And, it's striking to me as a political theorist is that nearly all contemporary political thought has developed in this period, and most modern environmental thought, but we don't usually sort of situate it as such. So these chapters are sort of trying to trace how political scientists and economists and philosophers and activists and others have responded to these really drastic biospheric transformations in thought and action, including in work that doesn't seem immediately ecological. So I look here at a pretty wide range of thinkers, from people like Arthur Pigou and Ronald Coase on the externality to Silvia Federici and William Baumol on domestic labor and service work, and a lot of others beside. So these chapters try to, I want to show how I think an analysis of capitalism and the sort of bigger picture view of capitalism can give us a new perspective on some familiar ecological problems and, mainstream policies that have been dominant in environmental politics for the past several decades. So everything from carbon taxes to biodiversity markets. But I also argue that looking at the free gift can help us understand capitalism itself differently. I see the free gift as something like the commodities shadow. And when we follow it, we can kind of go into these dimensions of capitalism that are often unexplored or sort of overlooked. So we look at, these, again, elements and activities that have clear effects in the material world, but don't seem to register in the sphere of the economy, and that are often sort of overlooked by Marxists who are sort of following processes of abstraction and looking to the distinctive processes of abstraction rather than kind of like what's happening with the concrete. But one of the things that the book really tries to show is that although we had this sense of capitalism as kind of perpetually commodifying and absorbing more and more of the world, advancing through the world, sort of bringing more and more of the world in and subsuming more and more of the world and so on. Capital doesn't just advance and absorb, it also withdraws and expels, it abdicates and neglects. There's a lot that is like left out, cast out, and so the free gift really tries to call attention, or I think helps us attend to these sorts of remainders, to what's left over when capitalism has commodified what it can and subsumed what it can, and sort of how it relates to these other kinds of things. It serves a reminder that capitalism can be operative even where some of the telltale signs, so exchange value or the wage or the commodity, aren't immediately apparent. Because things that aren't commodified don't thereby escape the overarching logic of commodity exchange. Things that don't have prices may not enter into sort of commodity exchange directly, but their status and the overarching structure of a society organized around that changes. They're devalued in relation to commodities, often with quite significant consequences, material and otherwise. Okay, so last, I try to offer a critique of capitalism that's rooted not just in its environmental effects, but in a kind of human freedom. And here, I think, the grounds for an ecological critique of capitalism can seem pretty obvious. Capitalism has long been shadowed by the charge that its satanic mills have ravaged the natural world and its calculative logic has disenchanted it. We know that capitalism, destroys nature, so to say, and in turn, nature has been often been embraced as sort of a wholesome antidote to capitalist artificiality and alienation. I am really sympathetic to a lot of these critiques, and I share a lot of the concerns they raise. But my concern is that I think they often take the normative status of nature for granted. They hold up sort of nature and its as a standard against which we should measure human society, and say, sort of the effects on nature are sort of definitive of what makes for a good or a bad society or system. But I think that this is a difficult position to hold if we take on board some critical perspectives on nature itself, when we recognize that, our understandings of and perceptions of nature are always historically and culturally specific, that human societies have long remade and transformed the natural world and vice versa, that there's a sort of co-constitutive process of remaking the natural world and the social world. And when we recognize even that the natural world itself is in a constant state of flux, there's no sort of clear baseline against which we could say this is sort of, this change per se is a problem. We can't, in other words, I think, just say it's bad to transform nature. We need to be able to assess which kinds of nature we find, or which transformations we find harmful or problematic. And that means I think we also need to understand the causes of the effects we're describing and try to confront them more directly. So I argue that capitalism is a form of rule. And, I'm a political theorist, so I'm trying to sort of push political theorists to recognize ways that, although we talk a lot about, our sort of decision making, or politics as decision making, about how to live together, about our forms of social organization and so on, most of those decisions and most of the most significant ones, I think, are made in ways, and, are either in terms of things like decisions about investment are made by a small number of people, or our decisions are sort of channeled in particular by these social structures that are part of capitalism. So I talk about capitalism as a form of rule that constrains our ability, both individually and collectively, to make genuine decisions about how to value and relate to the non-human world and to take real responsibility for those decisions. Capitalism basically limits our ability to treat nature as something other than a free gift. And I talk a bit about, so I talk about two forms of rule. So class rule, wherein a small number of people control most decisions about production, economic production, but also therefore decisions about the production of our environment, the production of our planet as such. But also market rules. So this is the ways that we're all compelled by our interactions and competition in the market, often in ways that go against our better judgment. And this is sort of my attempt to develop an account of, what some thinkers have discussed in terms of something like abstract or social domination, but addressed at a more granular level. And I draw on, as Fred mentioned, an unusual source, the existentialism of Jean-Paul Sartre and Simone de Beauvoir to make this claim. And I am indeed trying to bring existentialism back into Marxism, or revive some of that tradition of kind of Marxist existentialism. So I won't go into a lot of the details here, but I will kind of say more in the discussion. And I'll just conclude by saying I don't make a positive vision about how we ought to value nature otherwise. There's not an argument, about sort of what our relationship to nature should be. In my view, a lot of the debates, there are a lot of great ethical debates about how nature ought to be valued, but these are, in my view, effectively debates about a post-capitalist world. They're concerned with qualities like cultural meaning and ecocentric significance and, sort of elements that I think are not priorities in a world of private investment and accumulation. So rather than saying, this is what we ought to do, although that is the thing that political theorists often like to do, is to tell us what we should do, I try to tease out some more latent judgments and values that I think challenge capitalist valuation, even where they're not articulated as such. And I do think this is important because I do think this is another thing that the free gift can help us do, which is to sort of challenge, question capitalism's sort of form of value and politicize value itself. Because, as I've suggested, capitalist value, of course, doesn't reflect social wealth, and this is true in general. It's true for commodities that are bought and sold, as well as for the free gifts of nature that aren't. But we are used to evaluating the worth of commodities in exchange, and I think most of the time we sort of accept the judgment of the market as a measure of worth. So when something's unpriced, however, we're left without a measure of what it's supposed to be worth. We have to sort of think more about how we should assess it, what it ought to, what we think its value ought to be. And it's precisely because the free gift of nature fails to appear in this form of price that I think it can help act as a wedge into the broader structure of capitalist valuation. In particular, the extremity of this disjuncture I've been describing between, what nature's value should be, the sort of incredible usefulness of these things, and what it is, presents a particularly acute portrait of capitalism's general mismeasurement of wealth, and poses a stark question, which is if the planetary processes that constitute the bases of life on Earth aren't valued at all, why would we expect capitalism to value anything else as we think it should? So I will leave it there. Thanks very much. Look forward to questions and comments.
Okay, thanks very much, Alyssa. As I said, this is quite a rich and interesting book covering many of the topics that you spoke about. So the floor is open for questions and comments. If you would like to make a comment or ask a question, you may just raise your Zoom hand using the React button, or you may type the word stack in the chat and we will add you to the speaker stack. Or if you prefer not the speaker appear, you may just type your question or comment into the chat and we can convey it to Alyssa. So. Okay, don't everyone speak at once. David Bell asks, can you expand on how capitalism restricts freedom?
Yeah, definitely. So I talk about a couple of different things. So first is, like I said, is this idea of class rule and just talking about the ways that, I think this is a fairly obvious one in a lot of ways that in a society where only some people own and make decisions about investment and production, there is sort of, I think that can be characterized as something like what many political theorists have talked about as a form of domination, where, some people control or are making the decisions that ostensibly affect all of us, and that, most of us have very little power to or freedom to make decisions about how and where, we are making not only sort of various widgets, but also the things we need to survive, but also like the world more broadly, and that there's something quite fundamental about this kind of world making that's happening in the hands of a very few people that leave the rest of us, I think, unfree to do much about it. But then I also try to talk especially about what I describe as, this concept of market rule is trying to really take aim at the idea that capitalist freedom really is rooted in kind of, what Milton and Rose Friedman famously call the freedom to choose, and that free choice and market choice in particular is sort of the virtue of a capitalist society, and that is the form of freedom. And, I want to take aim at that both because I think it's very dominant. I mean, it has been, quite dominant in the past several decades as sort of defenses of capitalism. It's sort of the moral defense of capitalism, but also because I think there's been a lot of really great work on Marxist theories of freedom in recent years. But I think a lot of those theories have not quite gotten as directly into this sort of question of freedom in the market. They either kind of drawing in a Republican tradition that I think is a little less suited to it, or they kind of describe it in these general terms, again, something like abstract domination or domination by the market. And that often has some kind of sense of something like alienation, where we're not able to really, we're making these decisions, but, kind of market decisions, but they're producing effects that are beyond our control. And we're sort of in a world we feel like we haven't made. And I think what I'm trying to describe in my diagnosis of market rules is close to that, but I try to get into a little more detail of why I think that is, and to look really at like the structure of action in the market, and in particular, the way that markets really are supposed to sort of disaggregate intention and effect. So it doesn't really matter what your, you make your choices in the market, and it doesn't matter what you intend, what your motives are, whatever. All that matters is sort of what kind of comes out the other end, sort of what you make your choices, and then the market aggregates them and produces some consequences that you sort of don't bear direct responsibility for. So that's kind of the idea of the invisible hand, that, we go out and we just make our decisions, and we might be selfish and so on. But fortunately, the market kind of produces the best of all possible worlds. Of course, I think probably a lot of people would be skeptical of that version, but I think what's really important about it is that it's about sort of detaching you as the agent from responsibility for what your choice is, because it sort of goes out into this massive aggregation. Market freedom is fundamentally what the political theorist Art McGilvray calls non-responsibility, and that's supposed to be a good thing for defenders of the market, because it means it gets rid of these forms of personal domination and control and so on. But I think it also means that a lot of the visions that, if you follow that through, a lot of the decisions that the ways that we talk about something like freedom to choose mean that it's just, I think it's just incredibly limited. It's freedom and responsibility is responsibility only for sort of the effects on your life. So how did you spend your money, and what consumer decisions or products you have as a result. And there's no way of thinking about that as responsibility for the broader shape of the world, or how, you're not supposed to know what the things that go into your goods are. You're not supposed to know what effects they have beyond. All you're supposed to know is the price. That's sort of the fundamental theory of the market from people like, Hayek and Friedman. And so I think there's something quite perverse about sometimes the way we talk about responsibility, ecological responsibility for, or being, responsibility for sustainability, or things like that, when there's sort of a deep division between our ability to really act in the world in ways that reflect, or ways to act in the market, which structures so much of our action today. I mean, so much of what we do most of the time is just buying stuff, much more than almost any other kind of activity we undertake. And so that is just, I think, a structure of action that sort of fundamentally makes us non-responsible for sort of the results and the ways our actions move through the world and what consequences they end up having. And if that matters to us, which I think it should, I think it's a problem. And so I draw on, well, the reason I find Sartre and Beauvoir quite useful for this is because they are quite emphatic about, the freedom is the freedom to, to choose our values, to choose what matters to us, or what is meaningful, we think is meaningful in the shape of a life, but then to, have to go out and enact it, and to be responsible for it, and responsible for like committing to it and acting on it in the world, and not just sort of saying we have these values, but like realizing them in some way. And I think there's some interesting parallels to the way somebody like Hayek actually talks about responsibility for market choices, but I think that kind of like parallel can show how kind of perverse actually, and the Hayekian view is, and the limits of like what actually the how deeply constrained we are in realizing that kind of freedom, and again, like responsibility, taking responsibility for our own commitments that people like Hayek would suggest. So so I was long-winded to answer, but hopefully it explains a little bit.
Okay, let's go to Mark Bauer and then to Rika.
Thanks so much. That was a fascinating talk. I wanted to ask about the financialization of the earth and the financialization of nature, where it ceases to be a free gift, but they put a price on it. I noticed that recently Canada has dropped its carbon tax. And there were these non-market and market mechanisms that are in place and plans to put them in place. And I was curious as your opinion on that.
Yeah, so financialization, I think, is very interesting, and I guess sort of the attempt to put a price on all of nature is one of the things I take up in the book on natural capital and ecosystem services. But what I think is actually interesting there is the degree to which that hasn't happened as much as people have thought it would. So, there's been this idea of natural capital is now 50 or 60 years older ecosystem services, or attempts to sort of describe, various ecosystemic functions in terms of economic language. And then there's been efforts to kind of like convert that metaphor into reality in some way, and to, make nature or sort of ecosystems into commodities, to develop these financial instruments that can represent them, to make, sometimes describes putting a price on nature to save it, all of this stuff that I imagine you're familiar with. But I think what's striking when you look at that history of efforts to do that over the past 30 or so years is how much they mostly have failed. There have been a lot of proposals to, tap the wealth of nature, make nature an asset class, all these kinds of things. And I feel like every 10 years or so, there's a new wave of like investors who are trying to tap into this and make this a new area of investment and accumulation. And then usually there's a set of responses, both from critics on a kind of moral perspective who say like, this is a wrong way this is immoral, or this is not how we ought to treat non-human nature, or then sometimes from a more Marxist perspective, the idea that this is sort of like a new round of primitive accumulation or enclosure. But I think, in fact, like we've just seen very little of those materialize. There's very, very little private investment, especially going into, biodiversity markets and things. Most of it is public money or some NGO type money. Carbon markets are the only ones that have sort of gotten off the ground, and even that has been a slower and more halting process than expected, and they haven't really made anyone a whole lot of money. But these have not really proven to be a very good sort of source of or sort of site of accumulation and value generation. I think it is for various reasons, but the most significant is I think it is actually just quite difficult to make them into commodities. It's very difficult to privatize a lot of these services. They are, what economists tend to describe as public goods, where they're almost too generous, right? And there are places where people like Jean-Baptiste Say says like the wind and the sun, nobody, happily, no one can say that the wind doesn't work for me, and so they are mine. This kind of idea that like these things can't be claimed and owned by one person who can then kind of charge everyone else a rent for them or whatever. And I think that's still true for a lot of these ecosystemic services. Like you can make an instrument to reflect them, but it's quite difficult to block other people from benefiting from those free gifts. And so nobody's paying for them unless they're forced to by the state. So it ends up being states that are sort of the major players in constituting these as natural capital. And again, they haven't really done so in a lot of places. So these just aren't, I think, very good investments for a number of reasons. So I think, it's something to keep an eye on, certainly. And there are always efforts to sort of extend that the reach of capital further. But I tend to suspect that they are mostly going to be busts. And so, one of the things that I sometimes think Marxists should do is play a more deflationary role instead of kind of like, buying into what I sometimes think is like capitalist hype around their new product.
Yeah, hey, thank you.
Tarika, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much. Thanks, Alyssa. I haven't finished the book yet, but your article on hybrid labor has been very inspiring in many contexts, and I wanted to kind of continue from there, and the question of labor and non-human labor that you develop in that article, and the question of the possibility of looking at non-human labor as surplus value producing. That's an argument that's increasingly made by Dinesh Wadiwell and Les Belja and some others. who are developing this idea that actually there are forms of, like, for example, non-human animals, which is what Dinesh Wadiwell talks about, that are in industrial animal agriculture, especially who are harnessed, whose metabolic qualities have been harnessed into production. So maybe they're treated like raw material or like machines, but actually you could conceptualize them as labor, and actually they are producing surplus value and then could be understood as productive labor in that sense. Is this like, do you want to say something more about that? And maybe like another question going off from that is that one question which I've been thinking a lot is the different kinds of natural processes that are harnessed in different ways and that might have a very different function for capitalist production. Trees and the kind of the processes of trees or wind or animals, they have a very different potential for value production under capitalism. And maybe, can you say a little bit about the differences in these ways in which these forms of labor or processes are harnessed?
Yeah, absolutely. It's a great question. And that is sort of what I think I'm trying to do a bit in the four. So like the chapters that are about different iterations of the free gift are also really trying to look at different sorts of, different kinds of nature, more these sort of concrete side of things. And like, what are these different, because obviously like this sort of category, if we're thinking this like a social form or a formal category, there are so many like different actual particularities of all of nature within that. And so I'm really trying to get a bit more into them, like, what looks different with these different kinds of natures. And don't really address the question of surplus value. I think my initial, I would probably be skeptical about the argument, but I should read in more detail the people who have made the argument. Because I think my initial, I don't, like I said, I don't address it directly or sort of that role, but I do try to talk more about I think the ways that different kinds of concrete natures are subsumed by capital, and sort of the degree of subsumption of nature is quite important for the valorization process and for the production of surplus value. So the question of whether that counts as, whether the given a non-human labor counts as productive labor or not is an interesting one, but it's sort of not, I guess I come at it a bit orthogonally or something, which is to, try to think about how the ability to really subsume different kinds of nature or not then like makes possible the real subsumption of human labor and the sort of unleashing of these sorts of gifts of human productivity and the kind of mutual gifts of productivity. So looking at the differences, in the different concrete production processes and labor processes and the different kinds of nature that go into that, and sort of, in some ways building off some of the work that people like Andreas Malm have done in Fossil Capital to really like look at that with respect to energy, but say like this is actually significant for every kind of labor process. It's not just like when we think about energy, it's not just like the shift from water and wind to oil and or to coal, that actually that the sort of tension between the control over nature and control over labor is present in a lot of other like every other labor and production process, and has quite significant consequences for how labor is organized, and where capital is able to sort of successfully valorize production. So that's what I'm trying to think about there. And then I think that's, I have one chapter that's really, the chapter on industrial production really goes into that in a lot of depth, but I think that kind of through line carries throughout the rest of the book, and, is in many ways for me the distinction between something like, ecosystems and, natural resources, or like natural resources and sort of natural capital. It's sort of, I think we have all these different distinctions of ways we think about this is where nature is or something, that I think are mostly like the products are like downstream from how capital has reorganized some elements of the natural world and not reorganized others. And so thinking about, again, like how some of these things have been left out of, or like, capital's kind of abdicated them or ignored them because they're not particularly, amenable to incorporation and processes of value production. But again, I should read more on the surplus value question, because it's really.
And I just, thank you so much for your answer. Can I just add like one little extra question about Nancy Fraser has this term, she talks about boundary struggles between productive and non-productive labor. And is this like relevant concept for you, or do you feel like these are pretty much like stable categories? or capitalism tries to keep them as stable, and or where are the boundary struggles happening? Are they happening? Is this relevant to what you're doing?
I don't use the term boundary struggles or think about them quite in those ways, because I think I'm trying to get beyond the sense of that these are stable categories and think more about them as continuous. And again, like there are these like, distinctions in how far I think certain kinds of labor have been subsumed by capital, but like that's the main distinction I would say. Like that productive and reproductive, or like the reproductive labor is like a category produced by and internal to capitalism. And I think I find sometimes just like trying to get I mean, I use, you know, like I have the chapter like on production and reproduction, but I try to say like actually the same processes are at work in both of these ultimately. And that's sort of what accounts for like what we see as these like sectors or spheres or realms, is just like the different interaction of this sort of same social relation with like quite different material concrete processes. And so trying to kind of, get beyond what I think can be an overstabilization of the categories of production and reproduction. Even though I think a lot of what I'm interested in is quite similar to the things that Nancy's interested in. It's just like a slight difference of conceptualization, maybe.
Thank you.
So there's a question in the chat from Carol. Can you say more about the free gift as commodity shadow? What are some of the things left over after capitalism has consumed and commodified what it can? She says, I'm still not clear how capitalism isn't slowly commodifying everything, including nature, which is the core of your thesis, which is not a critique, just an request for clarification.
Yeah. So I think that this is some sort of question of something like ecosystem services and that we were talking about earlier, and all of these kinds of like elements of natural capital ecosystem service and so on are very much the elements of sort of the remainders or things that are left over in a way. And when you think about it, I mean, on the one hand, it does. I kind of understand the sense that capitalism has commodity everything. I think capitalism does try to, or like that's the sort of tendency of capitalists to sort of bring as much as it can in and to sort of convert more and more of the world into commodity production and find ways to do that. And I think that's certainly the tendency. So it's not like that's capitalists just like not interested, but I do think that there are a lot of parts of the world that are where it's more difficult to do that, and elements of the physical world, including, the sort of recalcitrant to sort of the reorganization by capital. And I think that shows up in a lot of different places. So in some ways, the kind of ecosystem services are the extreme of it. These kinds of like perpetually these functions that are really significant, but that for decades ecologists and ecological economists have said, this is the problem, that these things are not valued, and they repeatedly are not valued. And when you think about it, most of what happens on Earth is not commodified at all. Like, most of the beings, processes, etc. There's so much that happens in our world that isn't commodified, and I think is not likely to be, because it's it's very difficult to constitute these things as commodities. It's not something you like make and then can sell to somebody and then they have, whatever. There are these processes that occur on their own terms, on their own time, rely on relationships amongst like a huge range of beings, most of which we don't even know that much about. Capital has only kind of commodified and reorganized a very small subset of species on the planet, and those species now account for most living biomass, but it's a very small percentage of sort of like what exists in our world, and that I think is significant, because there's so much that has just been, again, like left out. And but that's a problem, because then those things, I talk about this as abdication, that capital, like, if something is not likely to be profitable, that's capital's just like not gonna invest in the reproduction of that kind of, species life, or that particular ecosystem or whatever. And in a world where that sort of drives a lot of what's produced and reproduced, that ends up being, a big problem. So I think there are so many parts of our world that have been basically abdicated. But I do think about, so I talk about that with ecosystem services, but I think there's a lot of other things. So, I talk about like the household or sort of the activities that are left in the household is basically kind of the remainder of what has been like drawn out of the household and commodified, and the things that again are like often very labor intensive, because the reproduction of human life is quite labor intensive. Again, it proceeds along these sorts of in accordance these biophysical processes and rhythms that are not on that kind of model of abstract time and the clock and the wage and all those sorts of things. So they're not necessarily worth investing a lot in. They're low return sectors, and those things often kind of get left to people to do for themselves or do for their family members or do within again within the household rather than in a site of value production. And then we call those sort of reproductive labor, household labor, but there used to be a lot of other things that were done in the household and then gradually moved out because you could figure out how to like make butter industrially instead of churning it at home, things like that. So those, I think of those things also as kind of remainders. But there's also, or thinking about the stuff that capitalism, what we talk about as pollution, I think of as like a form of surplus matter. You make commodities, but then you also make all this other stuff that nobody wants. Nobody's buying, you're just like dumping on people. And that's another kind of like element of, a remainder residual production that capital just sort of like dumps out into the world. So again, there are a lot of different examples in the book, but I think that, there are a lot of our material world that is sort of not particularly suited to the kind of cycles of production and accumulation that and the reorganization by capital that I would say are remainders in a way.
Okay, Susan is next.
Thank you so much, Alyssa, for doing the presentation today. I just finished your book yesterday, and it's just my first reading, but I'm really struck by how rich and important your work is for providing this new conceptual understanding of nature under capitalism. And I guess my question is, there are so many implications here, as you discuss, for organizing collective resistance and for reimagining collective resistance. For instance, it's really spurred me on to rethink kind of what we're doing to help preserve a public woodlands near us and allow it to become part of the old growth forest network. And I was thinking also about this idea of remainders, right? How we have some big trees there in that forest. They're, maybe 150 years old, and they're boundary trees, or they're trees that are on very steep slopes. So they weren't easily, harvested. And so they're remaining, like literally. But I guess I want to know more about how this conceptual framework has allowed you to kind of rethink some examples of collective organizing.
Yeah. Well, first of all, thank you so much for reading the book. I'm thrilled to hear that you've found it helpful in thinking through things. And I think, it's not a super programmatic book, but I do hope it can help us rethink like where and how we are seeing and doing environmental and climate politics. And I think one of the basic things I want to just say throughout is kind of contra the view of like environmentalism as a new social movement or something that's kind of like distinct from like a class politics or politics of production, or that's like oriented towards some other set of ends or values or something. That all of these things are, very, like that all of these questions we think of as environmental, ecological issues are just like absolutely connected to and coming out of the same kinds of processes of capitalist production and accumulation that we would usually think about, to draw those connections as clearly as possible and to say like this is that is sort of the basis of how we need to think about the organization of environmental and ecological struggles, that they are much closer to, a lot of the problems and challenges are much closer to sort of what we think of as like a classical labor struggle, or sort of the classical kind of anti-capitalist socialist forms of organizational problems that we usually think, and that some of these collective action problems are actually quite similar. They're like it's about how do you kind of get people who have some who have been disaggregated and sort of dispersed from one another, but who are being affected by it and having their lives organized by and dominated by like the same power, recognize that and come to work together and challenge it in some way. So, so I think I'm just trying to like in general think about how and where to do that, and to suggest like this is sort of like a reframing of thinking about a lot of environmental politics and trying to look at places where that might happen. So thinking, for instance, on the chapter on pollution and like social costs, trying to say like this is, we've often thought about this in terms of environmental justice, and I think that that is a very important framework for thinking about the unjust and kind of disparate distribution of environmental harms, and that's really important. But I also want us to sort of not think only about distribution, but kind of go back to that kind of question of production, like why are these being produced and generated in the first place? Sort of what is the kind of, how do we sort of stage more of a confrontation between the people who are sort of bearing the costs of these forms of bioproduction and then the producers of the byproducts, and treat that as, again, like another site of something like class struggle, where one group of people is sort of forcibly imposing this on others. And it's not just a question, again, of sort of, different people are getting different amounts of it, but that like actually we all need to challenge and that more basic organization of production, such that these sorts of harmful and noxious matter are being just generated and dumped out into the world. And thinking about, for instance, ways that that might happen, but also what kinds of institutions or forums might help kind of bring people together or be the basis for collective action in the same way that, we've seen historically, like labor struggles have, like the union or something like that, and thinking about like the rights of nature in that chapter as, I talk about as a multi-species collective bargaining rights, and like a kind of maybe an institutional form that can help aggregate the interests of people who have been both people and non-human people who have been, kind of subject to these kinds of domination, and to potentially like look at what are some it's just like kind of, again, it's like suggestive, but like have some like creative ways of thinking about what kinds of tools and institutions could we use to challenge the power of capital in some of the sites that we don't necessarily like think of off the bat.
Thank you.
I'd like to follow up on that, and I've been thinking more about your earlier book with your collaborators on the Green New Deal, and thinking about how that notion has kind of dropped out of the public discourse with the rise of Trump and the abandonment really of any serious action on climate at the COP meetings and so on. The way in which environmental politics seems to have been eclipsed in the last 2 or 3 years. And I'm wondering how, what the prospects are for getting it back onto the agenda, perhaps flowing from some of the notions that you're presenting in this book.
Yeah, that has been striking and disappointing, the real like drop off of environmental and climate politics, and like, kind of disappearance of things like the Green New Deal from the agenda. But I do think there are a lot of points of potential continuity. And in general, I think a couple of the things that I think kind of connect the two books and that I think can maybe be ways going forward are, again, this kind of basic, just like way of thinking of like climate politics as, embedded in all of these other kinds of questions and things. So we can, even if climate, it doesn't seem to be sort of on the agenda front and center in the same way, it's like, how are we kind of pushing forward climate questions and what are now at the center of contemporary politics, things like housing costs or cost of living, things like that, like how to have the kind of people sometimes have been trying to talk about the climate populist agenda. And I think there's some real challenges to doing that, like there can be an affordability messaging that's sort of like bringing costs down no matter what, which could just be like, let's just go fossil fuels all the way, whatever. But I think there are ways to think about how are we, if we're in this conversation about the general cost of living, sort of basic questions of like social reproduction and reproducing our lives, like how can we use that also as a vehicle for thinking about transforming some of the ways that we do that in a sort of climate direction, and thinking about sort of the connecting tissue of thinking about things like freedom, actually, I think are important, because I think there's often, the critique of the Green New Deal from the right has always been like, oh, it's going to limit your freedoms. Like climate change will sort of take away, acting on climate change will take your freedoms. And it's kind of like freedom is like eating hamburgers and driving your truck, and kind of these like very like not even just consumption, these like particular forms of consumption that are like equated with, for some reason, that's freedom. And to me, that seems just like a very bad way to think about freedom, I guess, like obviously, but there's a version of it, and even in some ecological thought that's like, human freedom has been purchased at the expense of the natural world or something. And I think we really need to not have that sense of like freedom and nature kind of like counterposed, and to say, well, actually, what's important is, for example, like the freedom to move around, to be able to, mobility is what we care about. That's important, and there are a lot of ways to sort of achieve that. And it's not freedom to say like, well, we have highways, we have internal combustion engines, and we just have to stick with them because that's what we already built. Like that to me seems like the opposite, sort of being trapped in the infrastructures of the past and kind of path dependency in some way, rather than saying, well, how might we reorganize things differently now that we know these things that we didn't know when we built the highways and the internal combustion engine, all of those sorts of things. And so thinking about things like, here in New York, Zoran Mamdani's fast and free buses as like a kind of vision of, of climate action that isn't necessarily billed as such, but that's sort of trying to rebuild a world on bases that are more, oriented to public transit and sustainable, and that also are giving people sort of that kind of freedom of mobility and, ability to sort of like live in and make use of the city they call home, in a way that can also kind of combat some of these other issues. So I have hope that those can be like the vehicles, no pun intended, of moving forward into kind of a new iteration of some of the principles of the Green New Deal, even if we don't call it the Green New Deal anymore, because that has probably been irrevocably tarnished by the endless, kind of attacks on it.
Okay, further questions or comments? While you're thinking, I'll just make a couple of announcements that I put in the chat. We have two important study groups coming up, one on animals and capitalism that our friends Tarika and Gizem, who are here today, will be leading starting on Tuesday. I wonder, in a second, I'll let Tarika or Gizem say a few more words about that. And then if you want to dig deeper into Alyssa's book, we have a eco-socialist study group underway. We will be starting several weeks reading and discussion of Alyssa's book on the 26th, and there are links in the chat for both of those groups. Tarika, would you like to say some more about animals and capitalism?
Oh, yeah, just quickly. So this is a continuation of the group we've led with Fred and with Gizem in the last 2 years on animals in capitalism, and trying to merge or bring together or bring in dialogue different kinds of critical animal studies stuff with Marxist theory. And the iteration that starts now, this coming Tuesday, is on metabolic labor specifically. So we're looking at how different kinds of focusing on non-human animal metabolic labor, and how that's harnessed in capitalism, and how that also connects to all kinds of other fields of industry like transportation or science or basic research or agriculture or gender issues on reproductive labor and biological reproduction, and so on. So it's a 5-session reading group, 12 p.m. in New York time and 6 p.m. in Central European time, which is where I am at the moment. But if you, Gizem, do you want to say something else to add to this?
Yeah, hi. No, all good regarding the announcement. I just wanted to use this opportunity to thank Alyssa for this wonderful talk and a wonderful new framework actually to think with. I'm in an airport, so I don't want to talk too much. It's too loud in here, but thank you all, and I really look forward to seeing you folks in our reading group as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. And needless to say that, Alyssa, your work has been very, very inspiring and important to these discussions that we've been having also. So it's great to be and hear more about your work.
Thank you. It really, it means a lot to hear that. So, thank you so much.
Okay, if no one has further questions or comments, Alyssa, would you like to wrap this up in some way, or shall we just leave it where it lies?
This has been great. So happy to just leave it where it lies and let everyone go about their Sundays. But thanks so much for coming out. It's been really a pleasure and great to hear everyone's questions and comments. And yeah, thanks again.
Okay, thanks everyone. Look forward to seeing you at future Marxist Education Project events and classes. You can always go to marxedproject.org for the latest information on our programming. Thank you.